All right, so for these notes, your heading will be Chapter 3, Section 2. This is all about the Constitution. Here are the objectives for the lesson. Also some key terms or definitions for important words in this section. This was the answer to your focus question for today about how the Constitution has formal amendment processes. Which ones have we actually used? So, reviewing that to discuss how amendments are made to the Constitution legally. All right, so your first heading is changing with the times. The amendment process allows the Constitution to adapt to the changing needs of our nation and society. That's why the framers created an entire article of the Constitution dedicated to how to change the Constitution or make a change if needed, because they knew back then that it wasn't perfect and that there would be changes that would need to happen. One of these facts that can prove that is that the U.S. has gone from a farming nation of less than 4 million people to a high-tech country with a population of more than 300 million. So that's an example of why the Constitution may need an amendment or a change made to it, because the framers knew that the country would develop and change. So there are portions of the Constitution that have been added, deleted, or altered as a result of these amendments. So we're going to write that portions of the Constitution have been added, deleted, or altered as a result of these amendments. The next heading is the amendment process. So this is how do you actually make an amendment to the Constitution? This is the process that the framers of the Constitution created when they wrote Article 5. So Article 5 of the Constitution describes the amendment process. So how can an amendment get started? Okay, amendments may be proposed by a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress. Okay, so that means the Senate and the House of Representatives. So both parts of Congress. So a 2/3 vote. So you have to have a 2/3 vote in the Senate and a 2/3 vote in the House in order to have, or even in order to propose, that an amendment be made. So there's 27 amendments to our Constitution, and this is how 26 of the 27 amendments have been proposed. So this has been done for the 26 of the 27 amendments. The other way that you can propose an amendment to the Constitution is that a national convention called by Congress at the request of 2/3 of the state legislators. So if 2/3 of the state representatives call a national convention, they can propose an amendment at that convention. And that's been done for only one amendment. That was done for the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. So in the history of the United States, that second one has only been done one time. All other 26 times, it was done through Congress. So same heading, the amendment process continued. So that's how, what we just talked about is how the amendments can be proposed. Like we propose this amendment be made. Well, to actually become part of the Constitution, it has to be ratified. So how can amendments be ratified? And remember, ratified is pretty much just like a fancy word for to be passed, or to be like accepted. So how can these amendments be passed or ratified? Well, 3/4 of the state legislators, So if 3/4 of the state representatives vote that the amendment be ratified or passed, then it's passed. Another way is that conventions in 3/4 of the states. So 3/4 of the states hold a convention, and it can be passed there. Note that this method has not been used yet. It has not happened. So here it shows method 1 and method 2 for ways that amendments can be ratified in the Constitution, how the Constitution lays out that they can be ratified. Your next heading is federalism. Federalism. So amendments are proposed at the national level and ratified or passed at the state level by legislators or conventions. Okay, so amendments are proposed at the national level, and then they're passed at the state level by either the state representatives, the state lawmakers, or at state conventions. A state can reject an amendment and later decide to ratify it. So they might say at first they reject it, and then they can later decide that, they want to change their mind and pass that amendment. But you can't do it the other way around, right? So a state cannot change its mind after it votes to ratify an amendment. So if an amendment is ratified in the state of Tennessee, a couple of years later, the state lawmakers can't then go back and say, hey, we changed our mind. We don't want this to be an amendment anymore. Another thing that's important is that the president cannot veto a proposed amendment. This really doesn't have anything to do with the president. It's really Congress and the state's decisions. The president is not really involved in the amendment process. Your next heading is popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. So what you need to know is that the amendment process is based on popular sovereignty, meaning that the people have the say, right? So how does that happen? How do people have a say in the amendment process if we don't get to vote or have anything to do with the amendment being made? Well, it's done through our elected representatives. So the people elect the representatives who vote to propose or ratify amendments. Some critics argue that conventions are a better way to ratify amendments than state legislators because state legislators are rarely elected based upon their views on an amendment. We're not going to write that. That's just some of the, when they wrote the Constitution, they couldn't get everything right. So there's always going to be people who say there's a better way to do it. So there are some people who argue that conventions are a better way because state legislators were not elected to make amendments or based upon how they felt about a certain amendment being made. So this is important. The Supreme Court has ruled that states cannot require a proposed amendment to be approved by popular vote before the state legislator can ratify it, which means that lawmakers can create an amendment to the Tennessee Constitution and the governor can sign it, and it can become an amendment to our state constitution without the people ever having a vote. And the Supreme Court has allowed that to happen. Sometimes amendments to state constitutions are part of the voting process. Sometimes when you go to vote for your senator or vote for the president, there's a question on there about, do you support A or B, or do you support this? Just say, for example, changing the voting age to a different age, and they'll poll, and sometimes they'll use those results to change the state's constitutions, and sometimes nothing ever comes of it. Even if the popular vote, even if the people say they want this amendment or this change to be made when they voted, that does not mean that the legislators, the lawmakers, or the governors of the states have to listen to that. So your next heading is proposed amendments. So most suggested amendments are never proposed by Congress. So out of 15,000 suggested amendments, only 33 Congress has sent only 33 suggested amendments to the states out of 15,000. There have been 6 proposed amendments that were not ratified by the states. Congress can set a reasonable time limit for ratification, which is usually around 7 years. So if the states choose not to do that in 7 years, then it doesn't become an amendment to their constitution. There's an example. A failed amendment include one declaring the equal rights of women and one banning amendments dealing with slavery. Those were amendments that failed that the states never chose to ratify during that time. Next up is the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They have their own title. So it's the first, what you need to know there is the first 10 amendments is called the Bill of Rights. They spell out basic rights and liberties. Remember back in our last section, many people would not ratify or support the Constitution if the Bill of Rights was not there. So they promised to include a Bill of Rights, and that was the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So currently, as of today, there have been 27 amendments. So that's your next heading, the 27 amendments. So many of the 27 current amendments were proposed in response to legal disputes, social conflicts, or perceived constitutional problems. So they are proposed in response to legal disputes, social conflicts, or perceived constitutional problems. So 1 through 10 was the Bill of Rights, right? Okay, so the 12th Amendment resolved a problem with the presidential election process. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. So this just gives you an idea of some of the amendments that have been passed. These are just kind of some of the important ones that it's hitting here. These are some very important major amendments that were passed. The 15th, the 19th, and the 26th Amendments each extended voting rights to a new segment of society. So the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And the 26th Amendment changed the voting age from 21 to 18. And that was an argument made by the military, because you could be 18 and go fight a war, but you could not legally vote in the United States. So that the 26th Amendment changed the voting age from 21 to 18. We're not going to write all the amendments down. But these are the 27 amendments. So remember I said the Bill of Rights are the first 10, 1 through 10 are the Bill of Rights. And then it goes on to tell you what every amendment was. So you'll just really want to know the major ones. Like the 13th one we just wrote about was the abolished slavery. The 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. We just talked about that one. Amendment 18 is interesting. It was the prohibition of alcohol. It made drinking and making alcohol illegal. So we're going to write a little bit about that. So in 1919, Amendment 18 was the prohibition of alcohol. It made alcohol illegal, right? And then in 1920, we just wrote about that one. Amendment 19 gave women the right to vote. But then if you go down here to 1933, Amendment 21 repealed the prohibition. So it took away, so Amendment 21 took away Amendment 18, which made alcohol and the making of alcohol legal. 1951, Amendment 22 put a term limit on the presidency, so you can serve 2 4-year terms. 2 4-year terms. And there are some more amendments. The most recent amendment to the Constitution, Amendment 27, was in 1992, and it was about Congress's pay. And that is the end for this section.